Welcome to Sleepy Scholar, where time slows down and history becomes a lullaby. Come sit beside me here by the crackling fire. The light is low, the world is quiet, and the past is waiting to whisper its stories. Rest your head, get cozy, and let's wander together through the flickering lantern-lit streets and timbered alleyways of old London, where in 1666 a single spark would change everything. London, in the summer of 1666, was a city alive with sound, scent, and movement. But when the sun dipped behind the rooftops, it became something else entirely. A quiet warren of timber-framed houses, flickering lanterns, and cobbled paths under soft moonlight. The city, though large for its time, was intimate in scale. Narrow streets wound through neighborhoods that had grown organically over centuries, like the roots of an old tree. Homes leaned in toward each other from opposite sides of the road, their upper stories nearly touching. Timber beams darkened with soot-framed plaster walls, and many roofs were thatched or tiled in worn clay, resting against chimney stacks that whispered smoke into the sky. At night, the sounds of daytime faded, the hammering of the blacksmith, the cry of the fishmonger at Billingsgate, and the gossip of market stalls at Cheapside gave way to the gentler rhythms of life after dusk. Somewhere a dog barked, a candle was snuffed out, and on the edge of Pudding Lane, the slow, steady crackle of a fire in a bakery oven glowed behind shuttered windows. The people of London lived closely in both space and spirit. Apprentices, laborers, merchants, widows, and children all packed into row upon row of buildings which shared walls and courtyards. Wealthier families lived slightly farther west, in homes with gardens and higher ceilings, but most of the city's population clustered tightly near the Thames. This river, the lifeblood of the city, flowed patiently through its center. By day, it was crowded with boats and barges. By night, it reflected the stars above and the lanterns that swayed from docks and moored ships. The scent of tar and salt lingered on the breeze, mingling with the sweetness of baked bread and the more pungent smells of tanneries and ale houses. Londoners, practical and familiar with hardship, went to sleep as they always did, not knowing that their city, centuries old and seemingly eternal, would soon be swept away in a sea of flame. On that quiet Saturday night, Thomas Farriner, a baker to the King's Navy, finished his long day in the bakery. The ovens had worked hard, churning out ship's biscuit, a tough, dry bread made to last on sea voyages. He and his daughter had been among the last to sleep in the building just above the bakery itself. Candles were extinguished, windows latched. Somewhere a watchman called the hour in a drowsy voice. Life slowed to a near halt, wrapped in darkness and silence. Yet the city's design, so quaint and familiar, also made it vulnerable. The abundance of timber, tar, pitch, and hay, the very things that built and fueled London, were also its quiet peril. Fire was a constant companion to every household. Hearths burned for cooking, candles lit the way in darkness, and even street stalls used open flames to warm ale or roast meat. But on this particular night, nothing seemed unusual. The air was warm, with only a slight breeze. Families huddled under thin blankets. Cats curled near hearths. Children dreamt without fear. By all accounts, London slept well, and in that deep sleep, the ember of a new chapter quietly stirred, not with a roar, not with panic, but with the soft, unseen beginnings of heat gathering in the shadows. In the days ahead, London's quiet timber would whisper stories of fire to the wind. The soft hours before dawn on Sunday the 2nd of September passed quietly for most Londoners. But on Pudding Lane, within the modest two-story home of Thomas Farriner, something unseen began to change. It likely started as a glow. Perhaps unnoticed embers lingering in the bakery's oven used just hours before to prepare hard biscuit for the Navy. Perhaps a spark had fallen onto kindling or a piece of timber too dry to resist. No one would ever know for certain. What is known is that sometime after midnight, flames began to stir in the bakery below the family's sleeping quarters. The fire caught quickly, feeding on flour dust and wooden beams, dancing up the walls in waves of orange and gold. The Farriner family awoke with a start, their upstairs rooms filling with smoke. Thomas, his daughter, and a servant escaped through a narrow window to a neighbor's roof. But a maid, too frightened to follow, would become the fire's first known victim. Outside, the fire grew. It leapt from the bakery to the shop next door, and then to the one beyond that. London, as always, was asleep. Few saw the orange flicker lighting up the early morning mist. The night watch was present, but ill-equipped for such an emergency. There were no formal fire brigades. Instead, the city relied on local buckets, fire hooks, and the occasional hand-pumped engine, a system designed more for containing small accidents than stopping a wall of flame. By the time bells began to ring and neighbors shouted warnings, the fire had spread beyond the reach of any immediate effort. The houses in this part of London were built tightly, often sharing walls and eaves. Many upper floors jutted over the street, creating a tunnel-like effect that trapped heat and smoke. Sparks floated upward, carried by a gathering wind. At first, the city reacted slowly. Fires were not unusual. A hearth left unattended or a candle too near to fabric could ignite a house. But such incidents were typically local and short-lived. Officials hesitated to take extreme action. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, arrived around dawn. But when presented with the idea of tearing down homes to create a fire break, he was hesitant. A woman might piss it out, he is famously remembered as saying, though whether those words were truly his, we cannot say for certain. Still, time passed, and the fire moved on. Citizens formed bucket lines from the Thames, trying to douse the flames with river water. Others used fire hooks, long poles with metal claws, to pull down roofs and walls in the fire's path. But the wind that morning had begun to change, picking up from the east and pressing the fire deeper into the city. By mid-morning, the bells of London tolled not for worship, but as alarm. Parish churches, always close to their communities, opened their doors to shelter the displaced. Some clergy attempted to rescue altarpieces, books, and sacred relics. Others simply prayed. The fire spread west, toward Thames Street, where warehouses full of oil, pitch, and tallow lined the river. These were not merely homes, but fuel depots in disguise. When the fire reached them, they erupted, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a deep, surging flame that sent glowing embers into the sky. Still, much of the city remained unaware, Those further from the blaze awoke to strange smells and reddish skies, but many continued their Sunday as usual. Morning services were held even as the distant smoke darkened the heavens. By the afternoon, however, word had spread. People began to pack belongings onto carts and boats. Horses strained under loads of chests and barrels. Some families carried furniture to nearby fields or even across the river to Southwark. Others stood in disbelief, watching the glow intensify. King Charles II, upon hearing of the fire, sent orders to begin demolishing buildings in the fire's path. But action came slowly. Few wanted to destroy property, especially not homes belonging to the wealthy. And so the fire grew, street by street, roof by roof. Yet even in this moment, there was little of the chaos often imagined. There were no screams echoing down alleyways, no masses in blind panic. Instead, there was the slow realization that something unstoppable had begun, and that the city's familiar rhythm had been interrupted by something ancient and unforgiving. Night fell again. London, lit by lanterns on most evenings, now shimmered with the reflection of its own destruction. The orange glow could be seen across the river. Ash began to fall like snow, and the fire, now emboldened, moved steadily west. Still, the air held a strange quiet, a quiet born not of peace, but of breath held, as though the city itself were listening, waiting. Monday morning came with no relief. The sun rose behind a veil of smoke, casting an amber glow over the rooftops. From the riverbanks to the high steeples, the city awoke under a sky that seemed closer than it had ever been, heavy with ash, streaked with firelight. The wind, which had begun the day before, now grew stronger. A persistent easterly gust pushed the fire westward, deeper into the heart of London. Whole streets ignited within minutes, roofs collapsing inward as wooden beams cracked and gave way. The flames, now emboldened by wind and fuel, leapt across alleyways and over courtyards, spreading with a confidence that felt almost intelligent. Panic was not a sudden eruption, but a slow and dreadful seep. Word spread that the fire had reached the Royal Exchange, the center of London's commerce. By midday, it too was engulfed, its stone walls glowing from within like a kiln. Documents, ledgers, and years of trade vanished into smoke. Boats on the Thames grew crowded. Merchants, families, and servants all sought to ferry their possessions to safety. Barges moored along the river filled quickly, some capsizing under the weight of furniture and crates. The river, normally a place of commerce and chatter, now reflected only the flames. It shimmered red and orange, disturbed by the occasional falling timber or the splash of debris. Churches fell one by one, their spires, once symbols of peace and piety, twisted in the heat like softened wax. Lead roofs melted and poured down gutters like water, bubbling and glowing in the street. Bells that had rung for weddings and funerals now crashed from their towers, silenced not by human hand, but by fire and gravity. St. Lawrence Jury, St. Dunstan in the east, St. Mary le Bow. These names were whispered as losses. Some tried to save sacred items, a cross, a book, a chalice, but many were lost amid the growing tide of smoke. The poor, who had few belongings to begin with, moved quickly. Those with hand carts pushed them west or north. Others carried their few possessions in cloth bundles over their shoulders. Pets followed at their heels, and children clutched at their parents' hands. Occasionally, voices would call out to friends or neighbors, checking who had made it out. For the wealthy, flight was more complicated. Servants struggled to load carriages, streets jammed with carts and livestock. There were arguments, tears, and at times, an eerie silence. People moved through smoke like ghosts, their silhouettes lit by flames behind them. Entire neighborhoods were in motion. The fire had now become something more than a disaster. It was a presence. Its voice was the crackling of beams and the distant thud of collapsing walls. Its breath was in the smoke that stung the eyes and filled the throat. It surrounded the city with a kind of terrible grace, beautiful in motion, but merciless in intent. That afternoon, King Charles II arrived in person to oversee efforts. Alongside his brother James, the Duke of York, he gave orders to demolish houses to stop the fire's advance. Troops were brought in. Fire breaks were attempted with gunpowder, exploding homes in the fire's path in desperate hope of slowing its march. Still, the wind pushed forward. The area of Cheapside, once a thriving commercial artery, fell. Booksellers' shops burned, releasing pages into the air like blackened birds. Smithfield's market was reduced to ash, and everywhere the fire pressed westward, toward Fleet Street, toward the Temple, and beyond. By nightfall on Monday, much of the medieval city had been lost. People slept in the open fields outside the walls. Some wept quietly. Others, exhausted, simply lay down and rested beneath the smoky sky. Many prayed, not for miracles, but for wind to stop. And yet, in all of this, there were moments of humanity. A neighbor helping another carry a load too heavy. A baker giving away what bread remained. A stranger holding a child while the mother searched for lost belongings. In the midst of destruction, Londoners did not become unruly. There were no riots, no great thefts. There was sorrow, confusion, and a shared stillness. The fire, for all its horror, did not strip them of kindness. Some even took time to observe the beauty of it all, strange as that may seem. Diaries mention the glow of the sky, the way the light danced on windows before shattering them, the silhouette of a steeple framed by flame. In the distance, it seemed almost like a painting, until the heat reminded you it was real. And as Monday gave way to Tuesday, there was still no clear end in sight. The fire had reached Ludgate and was approaching St. Paul's Cathedral, the spiritual heart of the city. Its great dome, still under construction, stood like a sentinel. Beneath it, thousands of books and records were stored, and many thought it immune to the flames due to its thick stone walls. But few knew that the booksellers had stored wood, paper, and oil in the crypt and along its walls. As the fire reached it, St. Paul's did not merely burn, it ignited from within. By midnight, the great cathedral began to collapse. The stones cracked, the roof gave way, and for a moment all of London seemed to hold its breath. The city, ancient, vast, familiar, was becoming unrecognizable. Tuesday morning, the 5th of September, dawned in a city unrecognizable from the one that had existed just 3 days earlier. The air was dense and sour, the kind of breath that clung to the lungs and lingered behind the eyes. The sky, though clear of clouds, was streaked with a strange gray light, a mixture of ash, dust, and something else. The residue of lives once lived and buildings once beloved. St. Paul's Cathedral, whose fall had marked the symbolic collapse of old London, now stood in ruin. Its great stones lay scattered, some blackened, others still warm to the touch. The lid that once sealed its roof had melted like wax, flowing in rivulets down Ludgate Hill, hardening into ghostly veins of silver in the cobbled streets. But the fire had not finished its journey. It continued westward, driven now more by the sheer abundance of fuel than by wind alone. Homes, shops, and civic halls all fell with a slow dignity, as if bowing to some greater force. The Inns of Court, those ancient training grounds for London's lawyers, began to burn. The fire advanced toward the Temple Church, a structure centuries old, and beyond that, to the very edge of the old city wall. Here, for the first time, there was hope. The wind began to ease. It wasn't dramatic. No great gusts, nor sudden stillness. Just a softening, a subtle change. The kind of shift you only notice when the leaves no longer dance and the smoke begins to rise vertically rather than stretch low across the rooftops. This small grace allowed fire breaks to take hold. Soldiers, using gunpowder and picks, demolished buildings in the fire's path. Sparks no longer leapt as far. Fires could be surrounded more effectively. The fire's advance was not stopped with a single action, but gradually through dozens of small, quiet victories. By the afternoon, the western edge of the city, the area of Chancery Lane and beyond, remained intact. People began to return hesitantly to streets where their homes had once stood. The smell of char lingered everywhere, not just from buildings, but from the very soil, soaked with centuries of human history now reduced to cinders. There were no loud cries, no dramatic wails, just silence. A silence born not from peace, but from the weight of what had passed. Thousands were homeless. Estimates from the time suggest as many as 80,000 people had fled or lost their dwellings, out of a city of just over 100,000. The fields outside the walls, especially Moorfields and Islington, were filled with makeshift tents, carts, and bundles. People slept in churchyards or under trees. Some built lean-tos from salvaged wood. Others shared shelter where they could. The king ordered bread and provisions to be distributed. Boats brought supplies down the Thames. Charitable citizens gave what they could, but there was never quite enough. Hunger crept in quietly, and yet even now there was a kind of calm. The city, emptied of its noise and traffic, had become hushed. Footsteps on ash sounded softer. Voices carried further. You could hear the flapping of fabric from a mile away. Animals wandered the streets, dogs searching for familiar doorways, cats curling up in the corners of ruined houses. Pigeons nested where they could, their feathers streaked with soot. In the distance, the sound of carpenters beginning to hammer together shelters could sometimes be heard. The earliest signs of a rebuilding not yet fully imagined. Many wondered how the fire had started. Rumors spread quickly, as they always do. Some whispered of foreign saboteurs, particularly the French or Dutch, England's enemies at the time. Others claimed divine punishment, a cleansing of sin. Still others blamed Catholics or nonconformists or even astrologers. A man, a poor French watchmaker named Robert Hubert, would eventually confess to starting the fire, though his story changed several times and he hadn't arrived in London until after the fire began. Still, he was hanged, his confession accepted by a city desperate for answers. The truth, that it had begun in a bakery on Pudding Lane and spread through inaction, wind, and chance, was known by some, but it felt too simple, too human. People wanted meaning, and perhaps in a way they found it. For all its destruction, the fire had also purged the city of its greatest health threats. The filthy alleys, the cramped wooden homes, the remnants of the plague that had visited only a year before, all were gone. The fire had burned deep, and in doing so, left behind a canvas. A city that could, in time, begin again. On Tuesday night, the glow that had haunted the skies finally began to dim. There were still flames here and there, but they were isolated, surrounded by blackened ruins that could offer no more fuel. Embers floated gently to the ground. The streets cooled, and for the first time since early Sunday, the sky above London showed stars. People gathered near the Thames and watched the water reflect a gentler light. Children slept in blankets, while parents spoke in hushed tones. The sounds of hammering, of carts rolling in, of life returning, all began to rise again, slowly and softly. And in that stillness, a new day began to stir, not with bells or celebrations, but with breath, with quiet, with the first fragile steps toward something new. As the final wisps of smoke faded into the September sky, London stood at the threshold of rebirth. The fire had consumed over 13,000 houses, nearly 90 churches, and countless taverns, shops, and warehouses. Entire neighborhoods had vanished, yet the city's foundations, its spirit, its people, remained. The Great Fire had been a disaster beyond living memory, and yet, from the moment the flames were truly extinguished, Londoners began to do what they had always done: rebuild. Reconstruction did not come overnight. In fact, for weeks after the fire, the city remained a hushed skeleton. Ash and broken beams still littered the streets. Chimneys stood where homes had once been. But amid the ruin, small acts of renewal began to appear. Carpenters set up stalls along Cheapside and Fleet Street. Masons gathered near old churchyards. The smell of timber and lime began to replace that of smoke. Merchants reopened shops from carts or beneath makeshift awnings. Markets returned, not to grand halls, but to open squares and fields. King Charles II took a visible interest in the city's recovery. He visited the ruins, often on horseback, speaking directly with citizens. His message was clear: London would rise again, and it would be stronger, safer, and more beautiful. To that end, plans were drawn. Among the most ambitious came from Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect who would become one of the most important figures in London's rebirth. His vision was breathtaking: a redesigned city of wide boulevards, elegant squares, and monumental buildings made not of timber, but stone. Others proposed similarly grand schemes: grid-like streets, canals, a new Roman-style layout. For a moment, it seemed possible that medieval London might be replaced entirely by something new, orderly, rational, graceful. But these visions met reality. The need to rebuild quickly, the complex web of property ownership, and the sheer cost of such projects meant that much of old London's pattern remained. Streets were widened, building materials improved, and regulations enacted. But the city's ancient layout, with its winding roads and narrow alleys, still shaped its core. Yet there were changes, important ones. New laws required houses to be built from brick or stone rather than wood. Roofs were to be tiled, not thatched. Building facades had to meet new safety standards. Fire posts and watchmen became permanent features. And over time, insurance companies began to appear, offering some protection against future catastrophe. Perhaps the most enduring monument to the fire was the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral. The original medieval structure, once so familiar, had fallen during the fire in a spectacle of flame and molten lead, but from its ashes would rise a masterpiece. Designed by Christopher Wren, the new St. Paul's took decades to complete and would come to symbolize not only spiritual resilience, but architectural brilliance. With its grand dome, one of the largest in the world, and its stately form, the new cathedral became a beacon in the heart of the city. A place of worship, yes, but also of pride. London, it said, had endured. In the years that followed, other churches rose from the ruins, many designed by Wren himself. They dotted the city like candles in the dark, each a reminder of loss, yes, but also of continuity. And so, life resumed. Children played in rebuilt courtyards, bells rang again from steeples. The Thames, once blackened by falling soot, sparkled under morning light. The city's population returned gradually, some to their old plots, others to new areas. Trade revived. Ships returned to the Pool of London. Guilds reconvened. Markets bustled. By the 1670s, the fire had receded from daily conversation. It remained a memory, of course, marked in sermons and journals, but for many, it became simply a before and after in their lives. The city had burned, and the city had risen. A monument was erected near the site where the fire had begun. Designed by Wren and his colleague Robert Hooke, it was a tall Doric column of Portland stone, crowned by a golden urn of flame. Standing over 200 feet tall, it was called simply the Monument. If laid flat, it would point directly to the bakery on Pudding Lane where the fire had started. It was not just a marker, but a message, a memory cast in stone. Visitors could climb its spiral staircase and gaze across a city transformed, not erasing the past, but rising above it. For historians and poets, the Great Fire became a symbol of destruction, yes, but also of purification and renewal. It came to represent not only the fragility of cities, but the endurance of those who inhabit them. London's story did not end in 1666. In fact, it was just another chapter in a long and ever-changing tale. Other fires would come, other challenges, wars, epidemics, the Blitz, all would test the city's mettle. But each time, the people of London endured, rebuilt, and remembered. Even now, if you walk the streets of the old city, down Pudding Lane, across Cheapside, past St. Paul's, you can still feel the echoes. They are not loud, not tragic. They are gentle reminders, woven into the brickwork and street names, into the curve of a narrow alley or the sudden opening of a square. Whispers of flame, of ash, of silence followed by song, of a city that once burned and chose against all odds to begin again. In a quiet corner of Maida Vale, London, on a spring day in 1912, a boy was born who would go on to change the world, not with weapons or words, but with thought. His name was Alan Matheson Turing. Even as a child, Alan was different. While other boys ran through fields with toy swords or played cricket in the sun, Alan was often found in a garden, watching ants form perfect lines, or lying beneath the stars, wondering if numbers could explain their dance. His parents, Julius and Ethel, were both intelligent and dutiful. His father, a civil servant in the Indian Civil Service, and his mother from a family with academic ties. But their world was one of formality and discipline, of pressed suits and handwritten letters, and in many ways, Alan did not fit. He was brilliant, but in a quiet, inward way. He saw patterns where others saw mess. He asked questions that no one else thought to ask. And he loved numbers, deeply, comfortably, like old friends. As a young boy, Alan attended Sherborne School, a well-regarded public school in Dorset. It was a place of Latin, poetry, and cricket, not of science and logic. And Alan, with his untidy clothes and curious mind, often seemed out of place. His teachers did not always understand him. He would rather solve puzzles than memorize verses, rather tinker with machines than polish his shoes. And so he was often overlooked. But in the margins of his notebooks, magic was happening. He was already thinking about the way the world worked, not in terms of beauty or poetry, but in rules. He saw the hidden structure in things, a kind of quiet music behind reality, and he wanted to understand it. It was during his time at Sherborne that Alan formed one of the most important friendships of his life with a boy named Christopher Morcom. Christopher was clever, thoughtful, and shared Alan's interest in science. They would spend hours discussing mathematics, stargazing, and dreaming about the future. Alan adored him, not in a loud or romantic way, but with a quiet loyalty and admiration. Then, in 1930, something happened that would mark Alan forever. Christopher died suddenly from tuberculosis, a complication from a long-standing illness. He was just 18. Alan was devastated. In his grief, he turned to science, trying to understand death, not in spiritual terms, but through physics and logic. He asked whether the mind could exist without the body, whether memory could be preserved, whether thought itself could be explained. It was not a cold curiosity, but a deeply personal search. The boy who had once watched ants and stars now wondered whether consciousness was just a pattern. And if so, could it be captured? These questions would echo throughout his life. By the time he left Sherborne and entered King's College, Cambridge in 1931, Alan had already begun to form the ideas that would one day become legendary. At Cambridge, he was finally in a world that welcomed his mind. The university was filled with eccentric brilliance, thinkers, dreamers, mathematicians. Here, Alan could breathe more freely. He studied mathematics with fierce dedication, often wandering the campus in his oversized coat, hands in pockets, lost in thought. Professors began to notice him. Not because he raised his hand in class, he was still quiet, still shy, but because his papers and solutions were extraordinary. He was awarded a first-class degree in 1934, and the following year, at the age of just 22, he was elected a Fellow of King's College, one of the highest academic honors a student could receive. But more importantly, he had begun to shape the ideas that would soon turn the world of mathematics upside down. He started thinking about computation, not the kind done on paper or in one's head, but in theory, about what it means for something to be computable. Could a machine, a theoretical one, perform any mathematical task given the right instructions? This question would become the seed of something remarkable. As Alan walked the quiet paths of Cambridge, past the old stone colleges, the lazy river, the soft lawns where Newton and Darwin once pondered, he began to sketch the outlines of a world not yet built, a world of logic and machines, a world of patterns and thought. Not yet computers, not yet code breakers, but the first pages of a story that would one day whisper across decades, quiet as a breath, strong as an idea. At Cambridge, Alan Turing had begun to find not only his voice, but his direction. While others argued over the philosophy of mathematics, Turing was already moving beyond arguments, building ideas that would reshape the way humans think about thinking. One of the central questions facing mathematics at the time was deceptively simple. What can be proven? It was a debate born out of the work of thinkers like Bertrand Russell and David Hilbert, who sought to define all of mathematics with perfect clarity. Could all truths be proven with logic? Could everything be formalized, calculated, and understood? In 1936, Alan Turing offered his answer, not with a declaration, but with a paper, calmly titled On Computable Numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. It would become one of the most important papers of the 20th century. In this quiet document, he imagined something entirely new, a hypothetical machine. This machine didn't have gears or wires. It was a thought experiment, a simple device that could read symbols from a strip of tape, follow a set of rules, and write new symbols in return. It could move left or right. It could make decisions based on its current state and what it read. We now call it the Turing machine. It was not a blueprint for a real machine, not yet, but it was a complete model for how any computation could be carried out. In theory, anything that could be computed by such a machine. With this idea, Turing showed that there were limits to what could be proven or solved using algorithms. He answered the Entscheidungs problem, the decision problem, by showing that some questions simply could not be answered by mechanical calculation. There were problems that no algorithm, no machine could ever solve. But more than that, Turing had quietly invented the foundation of modern computing. The idea that any complex task, no matter how abstract, could be broken down into a series of small, logical steps. That a machine could follow instructions, process information, and produce results. That thought in some way could be mechanized. It was elegant, it was powerful, and it would take the world decades to catch up. At the time, his ideas were too abstract for wide recognition. Computers didn't yet exist. The digital world was still a whisper in the dark. But a few noticed. Among them, the American logician Alonzo Church, who had been working on similar ideas at Princeton. He invited Turing to study with him. So, in 1936, Alan crossed the Atlantic. At Princeton, Turing was surrounded by brilliance. Thinkers like Einstein, von Neumann, and Gödel walked the same hallways. But Turing was not swept up in fame or formality. He preferred solitude, long walks, and quiet focus. He continued refining his theories and even designed a cipher machine, an early clue that his mind was already turning toward security and secrecy. He earned his PhD in 1938 and returned to England, bringing with him not only knowledge, but the quiet certainty that machines could one day think. Not in the human sense, not with dreams or feelings, but with logic, with rules, with stunning speed. Back home, the world was beginning to change. Storm clouds gathered over Europe. Tensions grew. And though the war had not yet begun, governments were already searching for minds that could do the impossible. The British Government Code and Cipher School, located at a quiet estate called Bletchley Park, was preparing for the task of breaking the codes used by enemy forces. And they needed someone who could think differently, someone who could see what others missed, someone who understood machines that did not yet exist. They needed Alan Turing. He joined Bletchley in 1939, just as war broke out. The atmosphere there was unlike anything he had known, both intensely focused and oddly informal. Brilliant minds worked side by side, surrounded by puzzles, tea, and the hum of urgency. Their greatest challenge was the Enigma machine. Used by the German military, Enigma was an electromechanical device that scrambled messages using a series of rotating rotors. With each key press, the setting shifted, making the code constantly change. It had trillions of possible configurations. To break it seemed impossible. But Turing believed otherwise. He knew that brute force, testing every possibility, would take far too long. What they needed was not speed, but insight. He began working on a solution, a machine that could search through the possibilities using logic, pattern, and process. Not a Turing machine in the theoretical sense, but something real, something that could help win the war. The bomb, as it came to be known, was designed to detect patterns in Enigma messages by ruling out impossibilities. It was a large, complex, and beautiful machine, rows of spinning drums, clicking relays, wires like vines in a mechanical garden. It would change everything, but that story belongs to the next part of our journey. Alan Turing had, by his early 30s, quietly laid the foundation for modern computing, answered questions that had confounded mathematicians for decades, and begun the slow, careful process of turning logic into machinery. And he had done it not with fanfare, but with calm precision, with thought, with care, with quiet brilliance. Nestled in the quiet countryside of Buckinghamshire, England, Bletchley Park did not look like the setting for a revolution. A sprawling estate of old brick buildings and lush green lawns, it might have been mistaken for a private school or a sleepy country manor, but behind its modest appearance, Bletchley was alive with one of the most significant secret efforts of the Second World War, the breaking of the German Enigma code. Alan Turing arrived at Bletchley in 1939, not long after war was declared. He joined Hut 8, a section devoted to decoding naval Enigma communications. These were especially difficult. The German Navy had added additional rotors and more rigorous procedures to their machines, making their messages some of the hardest to crack. But in that quiet atmosphere, where brains ticked as constantly as the clock, Turing began to work. He wasn't alone. Bletchley Park brought together an eclectic group: mathematicians, linguists, chess champions, crossword enthusiasts, people chosen not for military prowess, but for how they thought, sideways, deeply, creatively. And yet, Turing's mind still stood out. The Enigma machine itself, though complex, followed a precise logic. It had a keyboard, rotors, and plugboard connections. When a letter was typed, electrical current passed through these components and lit up a different letter. The result, a scrambled alphabet, where the same letter would rarely encrypt to the same result twice. The number of possible settings was staggering, estimated in the quintillions. Each day, the Germans changed the machine settings. Without knowing those daily keys, even intercepted messages were unreadable. What Turing proposed was radical. He designed a machine, the bomb, that would simulate Enigma operations rapidly and help narrow down the possibilities. Rather than attempting every possible combination, the bomb would eliminate what could not be correct, allowing analysts to focus on more likely settings. But the bomb alone was not enough. It required insight, starting points known as cribs, guesses about the content of the message. Common phrases like weather report or Heil Hitler could help the bomb find a match. And this is where Turing's calm brilliance shone again. He didn't just build machines, he created systems. He understood the interplay of logic, language, and human behavior. He grasped that the German operators had habits, predictable elements that could be exploited. Under his guidance, Bletchley began to crack more and more messages. By 1941, the team had broken the German naval Enigma, a breakthrough that helped British convoys avoid U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. Turing's contributions were vital. Lives were saved. Battles were won in silence. Yet, most of this remained unknown to the public, then and long after. Secrecy was essential. Those at Bletchley spoke of their work to no one, not even close family. For Alan, who had always felt somewhat apart from others, this secrecy may have come naturally. He lived modestly, often biking to work with a gas mask strapped to his handlebars, not for protection from bombs, but because of his hay fever. He wore socks with sandals. He stammered in conversation, avoided small talk, and worked with intense focus. He had quirks, yes, but he also had a gentle wit and a soft-spoken kindness. Those who knew him described him as thoughtful and deeply principled. And while others might have demanded authority or praise, Turing remained in the background, content to contribute quietly to something far bigger than himself. The bomb machines were eventually deployed across Britain and later America. They multiplied, improved, and adapted. At their peak, Bletchley's efforts were decoding thousands of enemy messages each day. It's estimated that the work done there shortened the war by at least 2 years. And though many contributed, Turing was at the heart of it all, a quiet architect of victory. But as the war came to a close, the world shifted again. The need for code breakers diminished. Machines, once built in secret, were dismantled or hidden away, and those who had labored in silence were asked to return to ordinary life, carrying with them knowledge they could never share. Turing left Bletchley in 1945. He had been awarded an OBE, the Order of the British Empire, but few understood why. His name was not in the newspapers. His work remained classified for decades. But in his mind, the next frontier had already begun. He turned toward something he had long imagined, a real machine that could think. The theoretical had been proven practical. Now it was time to build. Turing joined the National Physical Laboratory and began designing what he called the Automatic Computing Engine, or ACE. It would be among the first designs for a stored program computer, a machine that could not only compute but also adapt, store instructions, and change its operations. He was no longer talking in abstractions. This was a machine of wires, switches, and memory, a glimpse of the future. Unfortunately, bureaucracy and internal resistance slowed the project. Others, like the team in Manchester and engineers in the United States, raced ahead. But Turing's ideas laid the groundwork. They shaped how machines were built and understood. He was among the first to suggest that a computer could go beyond arithmetic, that it could simulate any process, even thought itself. As always, he was ahead of his time. He began to explore artificial intelligence, not as fantasy, but as theory. Could machines learn? Could they be said to think? How would we know if they were intelligent? He proposed what we now call the Turing test, a way to determine if a machine's behavior was indistinguishable from that of a human. If a computer could carry on a conversation and convince a person that it was human, could it be said to be intelligent? It was a playful question, and a profound one. Even now, it challenges us. Alan Turing's post-war years were filled with possibility, invention, and quiet perseverance. Though no longer in the spotlight, he remained deeply involved in the questions that mattered most to him: the nature of thought, the power of logic, and the machines that would change the world. He had helped to win a war not with weapons, but with ideas, and in doing so, he had opened the door to the digital age. By the early 1950s, Alan Turing was living in Wilmslow, a peaceful town in the north of England. His mind, as always, remained focused on puzzles, theories, and the tantalizing future of machines. He took pleasure in long-distance running, often seen jogging through the countryside, lost in thought. He was a man at once immersed in the world and yet gently removed from it. At the University of Manchester, he continued his work on computing. The machines were becoming real, large humming cabinets of valves and switches, and Turing was among the first to explore what they could mean beyond mere calculation. He remained fascinated by the idea of artificial intelligence, often reflecting on whether machines could learn, adapt, or even possess something akin to consciousness. These questions weren't just academic. For Turing, they were deeply philosophical, a bridge between logic and life. And yet, while his mind soared, the world around him was changing, not always kindly. At that time, Britain was still bound by strict and unforgiving laws concerning sexuality. Homosexuality between men was illegal, considered a crime punishable by imprisonment or worse. Turing had never been particularly secretive about his private life. He wasn't loud or defiant, but he was honest. In 1952, after reporting a burglary at his home, the investigation led to the discovery of his relationship with a man named Arnold Murray. Rather than deny it, Turing told the truth. The consequences were swift. He was arrested and charged with gross indecency, the same charge that had been brought against Oscar Wilde decades before. Turing, the man who had helped shorten the war, who had saved thousands of lives, now found himself in the courtroom, treated not as a hero, but as a criminal. Presented with a choice between imprisonment or probation, conditioned upon undergoing chemical treatment, a process intended to suppress his libido, Turing chose the latter. The medication involved regular injections of synthetic estrogen. It led to physical changes, emotional discomfort, and a quiet yet devastating isolation. His security clearance was revoked. He was no longer permitted to work on classified projects or to consult with the government. Though he continued academic work, he was now a man watched from the shadows, not because of his genius, but because of his identity. And yet, in those final years, he kept thinking. He corresponded with colleagues. He read widely. He grew fascinated by biology, particularly the mathematics of nature, how patterns formed in animals, how shapes emerged from equations. This area of study, morphogenesis, became a new frontier for him. Even in adversity, Turing's curiosity never dimmed. He maintained a small circle of friends and continued his routines, running, tinkering, and thinking. To some, he still seemed cheerful, witty, and even mischievous. But the weight of what had been done to him, the quiet erasure of his dignity and trust, could not have gone unfelt. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. The official cause was cyanide poisoning. A half-eaten apple was found by his bedside, though it was never tested. The inquest ruled it suicide. He was 41 years old. Theories, of course, have abounded. Some have speculated foul play, others have suggested accident. But what remains most important is this. Alan Turing, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, died in quiet sadness. His contributions unrecognized by the nation he had served. The world, at that moment, didn't fully understand what it had lost. Years passed. The secrets of Bletchley Park remained sealed. The details of Turing's wartime work were unknown to the public. His name faded into academic texts and private conversations, a whisper of a story that few truly grasped. But slowly, the truth began to surface. As classified documents were declassified and stories emerged, the world began to realize the depth of Turing's impact. Books were written, documentaries aired. Computer scientists spoke of him with reverence, describing how his ideas formed the bedrock of their discipline. He became more than just a figure in history. He became a symbol of brilliance unrecognized, of lives altered by injustice, of what it means to think differently, to be different, and to remain true in the face of silence. In 2009, a public campaign urged the British government to formally apologize for Turing's treatment. The then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, issued a statement calling it appalling and acknowledging the nation's debt. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. And in 2017, the Alan Turing Law was introduced, pardoning thousands of men convicted under the outdated laws that had once condemned him. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came in 2021, when the Bank of England unveiled a new £50 note bearing the image of Alan Turing, his face at last appearing in homes, shops, and banks across the country he had helped save. It was a quiet, dignified gesture, one Turing might have found curious, perhaps even amusing, but it marked a change, a recognition, a kind of justice. In the small town where he died, a statue now stands in his memory. In Manchester, in Cambridge, and around the world, buildings bear his name. Conferences are held in his honor. His legacy lives not only in stone and paper, but in every device that hums with code, every machine that thinks. For Turing did not merely break a code, he opened a door, one that continues to widen generation after generation. His story, once hidden in the quiet of Bletchley and the silence of shame, now resonates in the open, spoken softly but clearly. It is a story of courage, of thought, of humanity, and though it ended in sadness, it has become a light for those who think differently, live authentically, and believe in the power of ideas. As the decades turned and technology evolved, the world moved steadily toward the vision Alan Turing had once only imagined. A world where machines could think, calculate, and perhaps even dream. Long after his passing, the field of computer science blossomed into a cornerstone of the modern age. From room-sized machines that flickered and buzzed, we arrived at devices small enough to slip into a pocket, powerful enough to simulate complex thought and ever-present in daily life. And though the journey involved countless hands, minds, and breakthroughs, many still trace its roots back to the quiet brilliance of one man, Alan Turing. Today, his name is spoken with reverence in lecture halls, whispered with admiration by programmers and scientists. The Turing Award, sometimes called the Nobel Prize of Computing, is given annually to those who make significant contributions to the discipline. A reminder that his legacy endures not just in memory, but in practice. His universal machine, a theoretical construct on paper, became the philosophical basis for all general-purpose computers. His question, "Can machines think?" became the spark for artificial intelligence. His work in biology, once overlooked, has gained new interest for its insights into natural patterns and forms. In so many ways, the world is still catching up to Turing's mind. In our era of smartphones and supercomputers, it's easy to forget how radical his ideas once seemed. Machines, after all, were built to follow instructions. They were rigid, mechanical. But Turing imagined more, not just machines that followed rules, but machines that could learn, adapt, evolve. Today's world of machine learning and neural networks owes a quiet debt to that foundational vision. Every time a computer recognizes a face, translates a language, drives a car, or composes music, it walks a path first illuminated by the soft glow of Turing's ideas, and his questions persist. Can machines feel? Can they create? What does it mean to think? Where does intelligence end and consciousness begin? Turing didn't offer answers to all of these, but in asking the questions with such clarity, he shaped the future's direction. Beyond science and technology, Turing's life has become a lens through which we examine human rights, individuality, and the cost of prejudice. His story reminds us that genius can bloom in unexpected places, that quiet minds can change the world, and that society, when gripped by fear and ignorance, can fail even its brightest. Turing was not simply a victim of an unjust law. He was a symbol of the fragility of progress, of how far we must go to ensure that dignity, curiosity, and difference are not just tolerated, but celebrated. In classrooms, students read about him not only as a pioneer of computing, but as a man who dared to live honestly, even when honesty carried a price. His courage resonates with many, those who think differently, love differently, live differently. And in that resonance, his spirit endures. There is something deeply poetic about Turing's legacy. He worked in secrecy, surrounded by silence, cracking a code that changed the course of war. He imagined thinking machines before most had even seen one. He suffered quietly for being himself, long before the world was ready to understand him. And now, he is everywhere, not in loud statues or fiery tributes, but in the soft hum of a processor, in the gentle light of a screen, in the quiet wonder of a child learning to code, in the silent calculations guiding spacecraft through the stars. We live in a world Turing helped to imagine, though he did not live to see it. But perhaps, somewhere in his mind, he knew it would come. And so, as the night deepens and the world slows, we return to the image of a young man cycling through the hills of Dorset, thinking about numbers and nature, machines and minds. We see him sitting quietly at a desk in Bletchley Park, surrounded by wires and diagrams, drawing connections only he could see. We hear the calm rhythm of a runner's footsteps on an empty country road, a man running not from something, but towards something only he could sense. And we remember a voice, soft, bright, thoughtful, asking questions that would echo long after he was gone. Who defines intelligence? What makes us human? And can a machine think? In that stillness, Alan Turing remains with us, not as a relic of the past, but as a quiet companion to the future. For every question we ask, every mystery we explore, every boundary we cross, Turing is there, watching, wondering, smiling quietly as we take one more step forward into the world he helped make possible.